Okay, everyone, welcome to the Center on Asia and Globalization's third Counterpoint Southeast Asia webinar. My name is Selena Ho, co-director of the Center on Asia and Globalization at the Lee Kuan Yew School. I'm also an assistant professor in international affairs at the school. A very warm welcome to our online webinar. This is the third in our series on Counterpoint Southeast Asia, where we feature topics related to Southeast Asia, and we feature topics that Southeast Asian scholars are monitoring and care about. Today's topic, will the Mekong River be the next South China Sea, is a very nice follow-up on the last Counterpoint webinar, which is on the South China Sea itself. So this is a really nice segue into another body of water, which is a body of fresh water instead of salt water. And one of the things that scholars and policymakers have been asking and have been putting out the point is that, and warning actually that the Mekong River might be the next South China Sea. So today we have three experts from different parts of Southeast Asia discussing, will the Mekong River be the next South China Sea? The first speaker for today is Ming Li Yong. She's currently a fellow at East West Center in Honolulu, Hawaii. Very nice place to be situated, I have to say, Ming Li. She researches transporting water governance in the Mekong, and she is focused particularly on issues that are related to natural resource management, civil society movements and strategies, public participation, and the sorts of institutional arrangements in that area. She obtained her PhD in geography from the University of Sydney and has taught classes on environmental ethics, food, and sustainability. Next, we will have Charadine Pich, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the Cambodian Institute for Cooperation and Peace. And she's in charge of research, training, and publication. And she's serving as well as the coordinator of the Global Center for Mekong Studies. Now, the GCMS is actually in track 2 think tank network of the Langchang Mekong Cooperation. She has held various visiting positions in the United States as well as in China. And the third speaker for today is Pianporn Deetes, or her nickname, and I think she would like to be called that, is Pai. She is the Thailand and Myanmar Campaigns Director of International Rivers. She is currently based in Thailand, and her work focuses on the Mekong and the Salween. She focuses on the protection and restoration of river ecosystems and the rights of local communities. And she is particularly interested in Thailand's role as dam developer and financer, as well as the market for hydroelectricity of the dams that are being built in the Mekong River. So today we have a real treat because we have three great experts, young emerging scholars on the Mekong. I will ask that if during the course, I will first ask the speakers to give a very short outline of their views to the question that was posed to them. We will try to have a small debate on this. So the point is about debating. So we hope to have a lot of questions from the audience. And there is a Q&A button where you can just record your questions in there, and I'll pick them up along the way. There is no need to wait for all the presentations to end before you decide to put in a Q&A. You can put in your questions as and when you decide, and we'll do a Q&A after the presentations and after a little dialogue between us. Without much further ado, I welcome Ming Yong to start us Ming Li to start off with the first presentation. Ming Li, will the Mekong River be the next South China Sea?
Thank you, Selena. Good morning from Phnom Penh. I'm so happy to be back in the Mekong region to join this discussion. So my take on this is that no, the Mekong River will not be the next South China Sea because the geopolitical realities around the Mekong River are quite different, and also the transboundary water governance arrangements around the Mekong River actually do prioritize cooperation over conflict. I think one of the key drivers of the South China Sea dispute is really, disputes over territory and, maritime areas as well. And at stake are really valuable oil and gas resources, fishing areas, and freedom of navigation. So I think at first glance, the reason why people may draw that comparison between the Mekong River and the South China Sea, I think a lot of it has to do with China's role in this area. So I think security analysts have pointed out with, China building dams in the upstream of the Mekong River. China has a potential chokehold over the rest of Southeast Asia to leverage its interests over the region. And I think these narratives are also pushed forward by this very popular myth around water wars breaking out between nations over water shortages. But like I said, the geopolitical reality of the Mekong region is quite different from the South China Sea. Any sort of competition or contestation over water resources in the Mekong River is not driven by territorial disputes, and therefore it's a lot less politically sensitive as compared to the South China Sea. These contestations over resources are rather driven by when you have these mobile natural resources flowing from one country to another. And so any disruptions of these flows of natural resources like fish, sediment, water, upstream is going to deprive downstream states of these resources. I think we have to remember that water is also a renewable resource, unlike oil and gas. And therefore, with proper management practices in place, the potential for water shortages can be managed as well. In terms of the transboundary water governance arrangements, I'm going to focus on the Mekong River Commission and the 1995 Mekong Agreement. So it's very much based on cooperation and recognition of territorial sovereignty. So that means that each country recognizes that their neighbors have the right to economic development within their national boundaries. So even if there are transboundary impacts, these countries have been, quite unlikely to speak out against these issues because they don't want the same principle to be applied to them if they want to have their own development projects on their sections of the Mekong River and their tributaries. I think when we think about the political economic context of, say, hydropower development on the Mekong River as well, it's really not a zero-sum game. Like all the Mekong countries all have a stake in hydropower development, whether they are building dams in their own country or whether they are investing in hydropower dams in other countries. So in a way, these governments do all stand to benefit from hydropower development. So the biggest losers of hydropower development and water shortages in the region really are local communities who are living along the river. They're suffering from loss of fisheries, loss of sediment that are very important for agriculture. And so where contestation has occurred has really been around local communities standing up for their rights, standing up for the right to having healthy livelihoods and a healthy ecosystem. Pai can speak a lot more to that. So I think collectively, that's where I'm going to leave it for now. Those are my key arguments as to why I do not think the Mekong River will be the next South China Sea. Thank you.
Thank you, Ming Li. That was very clear, and I note your point that the Mekong River will not be the next South China Sea. We'll next turn to Charadine, and same question, Charadine. Will the Mekong River be the next South China Sea?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Selena. Good morning to everyone. It's a questions that I keep dear to my heart in many ways. When we're looking at the security dilemma of the Mekong, we oftentimes compare it to the South China Sea for various reasons. Particularly, well, literally, it looks as if it's another body of water, body of water that attract attentions, not just the countries that involve and not just the regional stakeholders, but also different stakeholders. I mean, outside external partner outside the regions that coming into play in various platforms. In very recently, my first argument would be that there are a lot and lots of regional cooperation mechanism coming to play, right? So this looks as if more to many as a geopolitics than it is more on a cooperations framework. But nonetheless, my argument is still that it's not going to be the next South China Sea in the foreseeable future, at least in the next 10 years, given a few primary reasons as follow. First of all, I think the Mekong River, Mekong issues has not attained a so-called regional status or post-alarming threat that encourage discussion at the regional level among all ASEAN member states, and to place it high on the Mekong agenda at the moment, unlike the South China Sea, which has going on for decades in that realms. In fact, if we were to trace a little bit, Vietnam's situation in a very unique position with regards to both the Mekong and South China Sea in many ways, because as one of the climate states of the South China Sea, and as well the most downstream countries in the Mekong, Vietnam usually being, in the situations where, okay, they have to deal with both. So Vietnam has tried to slot in this agenda during its chairmanship in 2020, but failed given the fact that pandemics, ramsons, and it was more high on the agenda than the Mekong issues itself, which again, as I mentioned, it doesn't pose an alarming threat that kind of immediately need attention at the moment. Now, when you look at what would you consider as an alarming threat for the time being, I would yell that to the recent examples during the recent last week for the issues of Myanmar, Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, and so on, which those seemingly pose more alarming threats than the so-called Mekong that we're discussing. So again, it doesn't pose heightening attentions that should be dealt with or should be put high on the agenda for the discussions. Also, there is a divided position on the Mekong issues between the maritime and the mainland. For maritimes member states, Mekong River is still an issue just between the 5 Mekong countries, because they don't share the river, they don't see why it affects the entire region, right? So this is one of the things where it's kind of alerting at that point. Although you argue that there is a verge of major power competition in Mekong subregions in various ways, but ASEAN member states actually would not want to disassociate from another body of water dispute, apart from the already exhausted South China Sea conflicts. So with that said, it still doesn't pose, in terms of politicization, it poses little to no obvious threat at the moment. Secondly, there is no, let's say, there's no military presence, or if you might call it, the risk of escalations of arms race as in the South China Sea. So it's still not that obvious, and if we were connected to the previous reason of politicization and security dilemma, it doesn't at the threatening level yet. The Mekong countries and especially China seems to reaffirm that the Mekong should be seen as a shared river and share resources, share benefits, rather than contesting for one ground as opposed to the South China Sea. My third argument would be that although there is a so-called congestion of the Mekong subregional cooperation initiative in place of about more than 10 at the moment, one should actually question the increasing importance of the Mekong subregion region in many ways. Okay, on one hand, you can be seen as a competitions, but on the other, it's actually providing more benefits to the Mekong countries concerned, given the fact that it provides tangible benefits in various ways. So there are different external partner who comes in providing different initiate different platforms, different framework, but it does provide tangible benefit in terms of primarily infrastructure development. That's what primarily the Mekong riparian country needs, but also with various project deliverable and implementations with all of the cooperation framework that has been yelled out. So as opposed to the South China Sea, we don't see that. We don't see that sort of mechanism in place. South China Sea is more about the core competing interests of particularly freedom of navigation and overflight, but also the resources underneath the contesting claims. So there is more reason to actually compete for those resources than to providing different platforms or to initiate any sort of initiative to move forward. Now, one thing about these congestions of cooperation is the fact that there is a missing link of how different stakeholders, how different external partners that been provided, they actually can work together in the forms of joint cooperation between different mechanisms in the Mekong. So if there is if there's linkages between those stakeholder, those cooperation, those mechanism and framework, that will be much better. And one way to do it is perhaps yelling out in terms of joint cooperation framework. So if let's say one corporation, one framework proposing some sort of infrastructure development in certain places, so other can also step in and providing a joint venture or joint cooperation in certain forms could also yell out, and it be seen as more cooperation rather than a competition over that framework. Public-private partnership is also another thing that we can put forward to push for a multi-stakeholder approach in that regards. And in that case, it looked more as if it's a development perspective rather than, and less of a geopolitical outlook that many has seen on the Mekong issues. Last but not least, I think the bigger questions in the Mekong is the hydropower dam constructions and its spillover effects to the downstreams. So many would accuse or pointing finger to the upstream countries that utilizing the Mekong to build dams for their own benefit at the expense of the lower downstreams. But even that's the case. The main nowadays it has been raised. This issue has been raised on discussion on various platforms and various initiatives. And riparian countries are actually looking out for alternative sources of energy and seeking compromises from their immediate neighbor rather than go all out of the way and blames the upper streams for their destructions and so on. So this is another things where I've seen more optimistic when it comes to the Mekong rather than pessimist. Also, if we were to link up to the above, when it comes to alternative sources of energy, we can also look at how different mechanisms can gel out or giving our shared resources, shared technology, shared skills to provide alternative sources of energy. But all in all, even with all the constraints for both environment and economic reason, I don't see there is a binding code of conduct on the Mekong to be in place as South China Sea in the immediate future. I think the Mekong issue is still being seen more as a development platform rather than as primarily another contesting ground in the region and primarily in the Mekong itself, in the Mekong region itself. So if we were to put in a code of conduct just as the South China Sea it would in tightening up the security dilemma rather than and cooperation perspectives, just as the Mekong has been putting out for the past recently. So I'll stop here and I'm looking forward to discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charadine. Like Ming Li and Charadine has also pointed out the cooperative aspects, the developmental aspects of the Mekong area. And then I note that you mentioned that there is no militarization of the Mekong per se. And you also brought in ASEAN, which will be a topic that we'll try and bring in later on. Your references to local communities and the effects of dams is a really nice segue to our next speaker, Pai. Over to you, Pai. Pai, who is from International Rivers, will speak from the perspective of local communities. And I think that's a really valuable voice in this whole debate. Over to you, Pai.
Thank you so much, Selena. My answer will be based on my 20 years experience working directly with communities and the local community-based network within Thailand and beyond Thailand for advocating for more sustainable and socially just management of the Mekong River Basin. During this time, the communities across the basin have struggled to have their voice heard and recognized by decision makers. But the key decision and impacts of the Mekong River are hardly driven by the concern of local people. The importance of the Mekong River, the access to the natural resources by the riverine communities been neglected or ignored in the decision-making or planning of the Mekong River resources. Instead, the communities are the ones who mostly bear the cost for this kind of developments. It could be hydropower developments and other kind of developments on the Mekong River resources. And the Mekong River itself start to protest already. There are signs that might show us that this could be already ecological tipping point for the Mekong River. For me, the question is that in this time of growing uncertainty and geopolitical instability, will the new configurations of power that emerge bring meaningful change to the Mekong River's management and the local communities that depend on it? And we're not talking about 1 or 2 communities, but we are talking about 60 million people throughout the entire basin, particularly the lower basin, and contending with powerful neighbors and periods of geopolitical change is not new in the region. In the past, trading with China and the lower Mekong countries, mostly done through the sea due to the many rapids that in the Mekong River, which impede large-scale transportation on the Mekong River. It was the French that first placed the strategic importance of the Mekong for river transportation as a trade route to China, but that mission was failed. In the past few decades, we have seen more and more Chinese influence steadily grow in the Mekong Basin alongside the rapid developments in southwestern China. This gives the rise of a Chinese-led project that blasts the rapids on the Mekong River in the upper reaches from southern Yunnan through Myanmar-Lao border, to Thai-Lao border, and to northern Laos. The intention is to clear the rapids and make the wider superhighway for large ships to be able to navigate, to bring goods and bring other things to the Southeast Asia. But recently, the plan was terminated by the Thai cabinet resolution. And also because of the protests of the local communities, because of their concern on the ecological destruction. There are more and more capitals from China that flow into the Mekong region that finance wide range of resource development projects, including large-scale hydropower dams on the Mekong River and in Djibouti. There's also urban development, industrial park, infrastructure projects, including special economic zones along the Mekong River, like in the Golden Triangle, northern Thailand and Myanmar, Sihanoukville in Cambodia, and more recently in southern Laos at the 4,000 island, the Si Phandon, next to Cambodia border. Chinese companies and investors often receive support from the Chinese government to enter agreements with their neighbors in the Mekong Basin. And in turn, the Mekong country leaders welcome this investment. as they see the value of economic development, while the cost, the destruction of ecological value has been bared mainly by the local people. China have offered diplomatic support for the Mekong region government that they are starting with the Lancang Mekong Cooperation Mechanism that launched 6 years ago, while the US also increased the engagement and profile in the Mekong region as well, including the Mekong-US Partnership, which also launched in 2020 and expand the scope of transboundary challenge to include water and natural resource management. So we are sitting here working right here with the grassroots communities. We are seeing the growing tension between two powers, superpowers, while we are not really seeing the chance for the voice, the concern of the children of the Mekong to be heard or to be profiled in the discussion. One would think that communities, those livelihoods are dependent on the Mekong River, are now living in the geopolitical battlefield, particularly between China and US, while there is not necessarily how things are felt or understood or experienced by those in the basin. There are questions around whether the geopolitical uncertainty helps increase or reduce the space and opportunity for local people's voice to be heard in their priority. For the people live with the Mekong River, the priority is for governments, developers, and other powerful actors to take meaningful action to address their concern and to minimize the impacts of existing development projects, particularly dams in upstream, dams in northern Laos, or the plants, dams, and hydropower projects should be reconsidered. And as Charadine already mentioned, there are many options available for the management of the resources of the electricity in the region, not only in Thailand, but also in Cambodia and in other countries. While these options, these alternatives been neglected, maybe because of there is no intention or there is no benefits for the large-scale investment. So far, it's unclear that what extent China and the Lower Mekong government will be more inclusive to addressing the transboundary problem, particularly the hydropower dams on the Mekong River. And neither it is clear that if the US is genuinely committed to open space for riparian communities, voice and engaging the Mekong country leaders, including China, to collectively explore solution for the ecological crisis in the Mekong that's facing. The fundamental problem is decision concerning development should be primary towards the interest of population of the Mekong River rather than the one that who hold the power, rather than the elites. Whatever power configuration emerge out of the current period of the uncertainty, what we need is the people living along the Mekong River to have much greater say in designing, shaping their own future. And that's my first take for this question. So it's not yes or no, likely no, but I would give the importance to the voice of the grassroots communities.
Thank you so much, Pai. That was a very nice view from the bottom, from the local communities. I think one of the key differences between the Mekong and the South China Sea is that in the case of the Mekong, there are seriously huge implications for local communities in environmental and in the area of human security in general, as opposed to, say, the South China Sea. I mean, there are fishermen who rely on, the areas around the South China Sea for the living, but I think, the density of the people, the communities around the Mekong River, that makes for a key difference in the nature of the conflict there, right? It's the difference in conflict we're talking about, whether it's about the human beings living there, or whether it's about, guns and boats and all that. Now, one of the quick questions which you kind of raised is, with the US and China being much more active there now, are we going to see a race to the a race to the top or a race to the bottom when it comes to things like environmental concerns, sustainability, and the voices that are being given to local communities? I think that's a question that we should be looking at carefully, of how geopolitical competition there is actually impacting, improving or deproving the life of the people in the river. Now, all of the speakers gave very rich views on different aspects on development and cooperation, on geopolitical rivalry, on local communities, about whether the conflict in the Mekong River could become like the contentious nature of the South China Sea as it is now. Obviously, there are dissimilarities, there are differences, and I agree with most of the assessments here. But I think that as a job of a moderator is actually, I need to point out some similarities as well. And I think that these are the points that we want to use for our little debate here. And just as a reminder, while I ask each speaker a question related to their presentation, there is a Q&A box, and please, you're welcome while we are having a little debate here. You're welcome to please put your questions on the Q&A, and then after I've got each of the speakers to talk about their views on a question I have for each of them, I will go to the audience for their questions. So this will give you a little bit of time to think about what kind of things you want to ask the speakers of. Now, for each of these, there are some similarities between the Mekong and the South China Sea in that, at some level, it is not a territorial dispute like it is in the South China Sea, but at some level, it is about territory in the sense that water flows do not respect political borders, right? I mean, the Mekong flows through all these 6 riparian countries. So it is a little bit about territories and disputes. And this is where the dam buildings, the differences between the upstream and the downstream countries are going to come into play. So at a certain level, it is about territory, not a dispute per se, but there is that overflow into the idea of sovereignty, right? Who has a sovereign right to use the waters within their territories, because there are implications for their neighbors further downstream or upstream. It is also about resources, different type of resources, not gas per se, but this is about water resources. Water is renewable, but you can build dams and shut off water to others. So that's a concern about resources. And as everyone pointed out on the panel, it is overcrowded with major power interests, in particular China and the US, but also with the involvement of US allies, Japan, Australia, and South Korea. India also has some interest in the Mekong in that area. So these are the same players that you're seeing in the South China Sea. So the issues and the interests are going to be conflated to a certain extent. And then obviously there are environmental issues that have been pointed out by everyone on the panel as well. And there are predictions by people who study environmental scholars, that at some level, when environmental issues and resource scarcity are being put together, if we are seeing global warming, climate change, and resources, water become more scarce, rivers drying up, and then there are environmental issues involved in all of these as well, and then there's all this development that's going in the Mekong area. This could actually lead to a more conflictual and contentious future for everyone who's living around in the Mekong River. So all these can actually lead to a more conflictual and contentious future. So that should not be discounted as well. And then there are also these concerns over so-called issue leakages between the South China Sea and the Mekong River. For instance, Vietnam, right? Vietnam is the most downstream of all the countries in the Mekong, but it also has a territorial dispute with China in the South China Sea. So Vietnam, being downstream, actually fears that the Chinese can use the Mekong, the threat to shut off the water, right, from the dam by using the dams upstream to gain leverage on the South China Sea dispute. So depending on how each country's interests are being played out, some of them do see their linkage to the South China Sea. And that is itself quite interesting, right? So of these points together, these are actually some of the similarities and some of the linkages between the Mekong and the South China Sea that I think that we should all be concerned about and to be looking out for. Now, for each of the speakers today, I would have one specific question in relation to your presentation that I would like you to elaborate on, and also as a way of provoking some responses, a little bit of a debate. Okay, for Charadine, let me start with Charadine first. Okay, so you pointed out that there are actually no obvious security threats at the moment, which I agree with you. Unlike the South China Sea, there is no military presence. But we know that the Chinese military have wanted to send in PLA Navy boats, especially after the incident when Chinese sailors were killed by armed robbers or pirates, okay? I mean, everyone will tell me that they are not considered pirates because they're not in the high seas, but they are armed robbers, okay? So, and then we know that there are joint patrols that are going on in the middle reaches of the Mekong. The Thai Navy also has a presence, a military presence there, if I'm not wrong. My question is, what is the potential for a securitization of the Mekong given these trends? You have also pointed out that Mekong has become increasingly overcrowded, right? About 13 of these sub-regional cooperation frameworks involving all these major powers. So the big question is the region becomes increasingly militarized and as geopolitical rivalry intensifies, what are the chances of the Mekong becoming a South China Sea? I mean, probably not in the next 10 years, but beyond the 10 years. If we look at these trends, is there the danger of the Mekong becoming as contentious as the South China Sea? Charadine.
Thank you, Selena. My response would rather be short because I'm not military expert, but I think in South China, in Southeast Asia, pirate at the sea or at the water, if you like to call it, is quite common in many ways because we are either connected by river or the sea. So it's quite common in countries like Cambodia, Laos, Thailand also, and cross-border trade and stuff flow through water and through the sea. I mean, if you look at the geography, the Lê Sáp River, which is the biggest freshwater lake in Cambodia, very well connected with the Mekong, and it has unique flow in various ways. So they're doing this sort of fishery trades with one another with the neighboring countries quite often. So I think it's common with to have the aspects of pirate at sea or at the water in the sub-region in that case. And to protect their own people, of course, they're doing patrolling and all that. But I still don't see it as an arms race, just as in the case of South China Sea. So I'll see it more commonly as patrolling in the water that's surrounding, protecting your own people if there are cases at the sea, which is quite common. So I still don't see it as obvious. And even in the case of, let's say in that regard, being patrolling at the sea and all that, there's no military or arms race or external arms race, just as in the case of South China Sea, where it's not just between those that are involved, but also the presence of military, naval stuff like that from external partner coming in as well. So this create another tension sort of, and a lot of spillover effects in various ways. But compared to South China Sea, this is a very minor issues of being patrolling, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, if for some reason in the future we do see the PLA Navy on the Mekong, I mean, I don't know whether there's a possibility in the future, but if, you know, for security reasons and for some reason that happened and we see the PLA Navy there, it's kind of difficult to have the US justify its a Navy presence there. I mean, if the US is in South China Sea, there's freedom of navigation, you know, it's the Navy has, the US has naval bases in Japan, South Korea, and all that. So it actually makes sense for them to have a military presence there. But it will be difficult, for instance, that you can actually justify external powers having a military presence, a naval presence in that part. Now, let me ask Ming Yong. Let me turn to Ming Yong. Ming Li. Ming Li Yong. So Ming Li, I kind of skipped the Li, it's in the middle. They have argued that the Mekong River will not be the next South China Sea because of the cooperative governance structures there, the geopolitical realities there are very different. There are no territorial disputes per se. And you have actually pointed out that water scholars, the water scholars who have actually pointed out that there has never been a war that has broken out over water alone, which I totally agree with you. But water itself, while not the cause of a war, at least between countries, it has been a pretext for war. And we have seen that being played out in the Middle East. So we had to set water in larger geopolitical context in the bilateral and trilateral and multilateral relations among riparian states, right? So when relations are bad between countries, there is always that fear that water can be used as a pretext, as a prelude, as an excuse for war. But there are, although all these riparian states in the Mekong region have cooperated relatively well, they do have border and historical problems between them. Should any of these escalate, what are the chances of water being used as a pretext to start an armed conflict? Or or that these kind of issues can intensify conflict to the extent that is short of war, but which could prove highly destabilizing for the region. Ming Li?
Thanks, Selena. I think that's a really great question to bring up because it's, like you said, it's really important to think about the linkages between different issues, and even where it hasn't been a very tense situation along the Mekong, was the potential of that being linked to other issues that could drive conflict in the region. I think for the Mekong, I would really like to draw attention to the Mekong River Commission and the 1995 Agreement on the Cooperation for the Sustainable Development of the Mekong River Basin, or for short, in short known as the 95 Mekong Agreement. So while in the case of the South China Sea, there has been, a lot of talk about, these states are having so much trouble coming to an agreement on a code of conduct. But in the Mekong region, there is actually, these rules in place to manage the reasonable and equitable use of the Mekong's waters. Granted, China is not part of the MRC or the Mekong Agreement, but in the Mekong Agreement, Article 4 states very clearly that cooperation takes place on the basis of sovereign equality and territorial integrity in the utilization and protection of the water resources of the Mekong River Basin. Another procedure in the agreement that applies to development projects on the Mekong River's mainstream also states this is, even where consultation procedures in place, this is neither a right to veto the use of the Mekong River's waters by any riparian nation. And I think even in terms of, the developments that have taken place along the Mekong River, we've seen that dam building, for example, has led to these impacts downstreams so for example, Chinese dams upstream have really affected local communities in Thailand and Laos who are experiencing water fluctuations that literally wash away dry season livelihoods relating to picking algae from the river or their riverside garden banks. But I feel that based on what I have observed, the downstream state reactions to what's been happening upstream have been relatively muted. So for example, when the Xayaburi Dam and Basahong Dam being proposed by Laos, these are dams in the mainstream of the Mekong River. Cambodia and Vietnam, who are downstream, were very concerned about the transboundary impacts of this. And they wanted Laos to reconsider building these dams. But even though it went through the MRC consultative process, Laos in the end went ahead with the construction of these dams. And the issue was kind of left to be solved bilaterally rather than through the MRC mechanisms. Even if we think about Chinese upstream dams and the issue of water Vietnam being deprived of water from the upstream, I think the 2016 drought really pointed out or highlighted how Vietnam would have reacted to something like that. So during the 2016 drought, there were a lot of water shortages along the river, and Vietnam actually requested for China to release water from their dams upstream. And when China released the water, publicly, Vietnam acknowledged this as an act of goodwill from China to help a downstream neighbor. So the way that Vietnam reacts to China in the Mekong region is very different from how they have reacted to China in the South China Sea. I think it's very important to also point out that Vietnam is not just a downstream country. If you think about the tributary systems of the Mekong, Vietnam is also an upstream country, and they do have dams upstream of Cambodia as well. In terms of border conflicts, I think the most contentious issue we've seen in the region, not near the river, but that actually came to armed conflict in recent history, was the Preah Vihear temple conflict, that the border along the Preah Vihear temple. And that was in part, also driven by very strong, nationalist movements in Thailand and Cambodia. And I don't see that happening in relation to Mekong River issues. I think if you spend time along the Mekong River and you spend time along the areas where the Mekong River is on the border, so for example, the Thai-Lao border, the Cambodia-Lao border, you will find that movement along these borders are relatively fluid. There are a lot of informal movement across these borders. Villagers living on either side of the river are likely to have strong historical and even family linkages across these borders. So, really the nature of these watery, riverine border areas are also very different from, an unresolved, disputed territorial area in the South China Sea or a land border between these countries. But I think that you do bring up a very good point that, let's say in the future, if there's an extremely nationalist government in place or a very nationalist opposition party in place that wants to use these issues to, advance their interests, it is possible that, tensions could rise. But based on, historical events in recent history, I haven't seen that happening yet.
Yeah, I agree with you, Ming Li. Basically, I think what is different about the Mekong compared to other river basins, say, for example, in the Middle East, for example, where water has been used as a pretext for war, is that the relations, there's a history of cooperation despite differences among the 6 riparian states. Whether, as you mentioned, porous borders, people flow, very easily across the rivers and tributaries, and each of these countries are involved in, they have companies involved in each other's hydropower projects, right? I mean, the Vietnamese are also building dams upstream, despite being the one downstream suffering from some of these consequences of having dams. So there is this history of cooperation, and I think that helps to mitigate the kind of scenario that we have been talking about. Although, we should never, put that as an impossibility, just a very low chance, but not impossibility. And we have to be aware that, water is not just about water alone, but that there is always a larger geopolitical context to water. Let me now turn to Pai, because Pai's views are very much appreciated for, when you look at it from the perspective of local communities. And I agree with you, local communities need to be consulted and their inputs taken on decisions made on the Mekong. I mean, there are real human security issues involved, such as the possibility of climate refugees. That's the idea of climate refugees that have been brought up. For example, alarms over the Tonlak Sap in Cambodia, dying fisheries, etc. That is where a lot of the Cambodians get their fish from. And in that sense, it's almost an existential issue because it's about food security and human security here. For me, if I were to draw comparisons with the South China Sea, not the same kind of conflict, not of the same nature, but from the perspective of human security, the Mekong is as contentious as South China Sea to me in that perspective, the human security part. Would you agree with me? And how real is the potential for climate refugees or refugees brought about the negative externalities of dams? What is actually happening on the ground? Are communities disappearing and perishing as the Mekong could no longer sustain life? I asked this question because I was recently in Thailand and in Chiang Rai and Chiang Khong. I actually met Kruti, by the way, Kruti, who is the winner of the Goldman Environmental Prize. He was credited with lobbying and putting pressure on the Thai government to stop the blasting of the rapids, right? So it was great meeting him, but when I asked him about the local communities, a lot of them said that the local communities have just simply moved away. He had his Mekong school, next to the river itself, but I don't see any local communities in the area. They all have moved away, I was told. Pai, so could you tell us what is happening to these local communities? And would you agree with me at some level, if you would think in terms of human security point of view, the Mekong could be as contentious as the South China Sea? And how real is this potential for climate refugees or refugees from the dams as a result of the dams? Thank you, Pai.
Yes, the climate plus dams impacts refugees real in the Mekong region, I would say. When I start my career in 2002 and visiting fishing communities in Chiang Rai province, we talked to like more than 200 fishermen queuing up at the mouth of the Mekong River, waiting for their turn to lay the nets at the Mekong River at that famous fishing ground. But if you go there today, you will see not more than a few fishermen, because they couldn't catch fish anymore. The most lucky one might get 1 or 2 kilos, and that's their time, the whole day. That's the fuel that they have to pay. So we've seen more and more people are turning their back to the Mekong River, sadly, and they are forced to do that. It's not their choice. So many people have to turn into other industry to sustain their security, to sustain their income and sustain their food security. And but I would say that it's not that everybody is accepting that. We know that something is wrong and this needs to be fixed. To next week, Sayaburi Dam lawsuit that the people in 8 Mekong provinces in Thailand file a historical lawsuit at the Thai Administrative Court against 5 Thai state agencies for not complying to the Thai laws for ensuring public participation regarding the construction and the power purchase agreements from the Sayaburi Dam in Laos that is built by the Thai company, and the power purchase agreement is signed by the Thai Electricity Authority, EGAT. The lawsuit was filed 10 years and 10 days. And on the 17th of August, the Supreme Administrative Court will read the final verdict. Even though we are not very hopeful, but this will show us, if it's successful, we will see the mechanism to ensure extraterritorial obligation, even though the dam is outside the country, but the law needs to follow that. But if it's failed, we will see huge room for improvement for the mechanism to ensure governance and more equitable management of the Mekong River resources. So I would say that the climate plus hydropower impacts refugees there, but not all of them are accepting that. Many of them standing up and trying to defend for their rights and trying to explain to the ones who have power that, yeah, we are here. You should listen to us too. And they are looking for better law enforcement and better regulation over the Mekong transboundary resource management. That would be my short answer. And I'm seeing the long line of comments and questions, so happy to talk on over that too.
Yeah, let me follow up, Pai, because I have one more question, which is that related to climate and dam refugees. I mean, do we actually see that happening already? I mean, I can imagine that if there are climate refugees or dam refugees from, say, the people who live in the Tonlat sub area, I imagine that Thailand will be the one who has to receive these refugees. Is this already happening or is not yet happening?
It's happening and it's growing.
Where are they? Where are they?
Along the Mekong River in northern Thailand, like Chiang Rai and other 7 provinces along the Mekong River in northeast Thailand. So as I said, the fishing ground can be one of the most example that you can see that in the past you see lots of them, but now when you go, you just see empty river. You just meet a few of them, and as I said, it's not their choice. They are forced to decide on that. So and no one, or there is no mechanism to talk about compensation, talking about impacts mitigation measures. The dams are operating as nothing happened. The dams in upstream, the dams in Sayaburi Dam, Donsong Dam operating as no one is bearing the cost, but the cost there, refugees there. So how does
the Thai government deal with this? How does the Thai government deal with these refugees?
I would say that at least for the past 8 years, the semi-military government in Thailand been pretty blind on the Mekong issues. They are sitting comfortably in the aircon room in Bangkok, and they understand very little about the issues over the Mekong river management. So we hope that in the future, if we have like better or more accountable government and governance, this problem will be solved in the sustainable manner.
Okay, thanks, Pai. We have some really interesting questions here. Let me try and pick up some of them in the interest of time. I'm going to take 2 from Richard Grunwald. The first question is addressed to Charadine. I fully agree that regional water cooperation initiatives, the institutions there, are overlapping, yet I'm not convinced that organizing more meetings with multiple stakeholders will provide feasible solutions. Instead, it may cement participation fatigue and frustration from the vague public engagement. So Charadine, you might want to respond to that. Not exactly a question, but a comment. And then for Pai, regarding the blasting of the Rapids project, many foreign observers consider the suspension of this project as an act of civil society and Mekong heroes like Kruti, right? Yet this, Richard is saying that the project has been jointly cancelled both by China and Thailand. So he's asking whether, other than this, that is not really, it may not be the effect of civil society, but other political economic factors, economic feasibility during COVID, good neighborhood policy, are these possible drivers for this decision instead of the pressure from civil society? So Charadine first, and then Pai.
Thank you, Selena, and also thank you for the questions. Well, at some point, I agree to a certain extent that there is a sort of participation fatigue if we were to propose for more multi-stakeholder approach in that regard. But I don't see it as a better approach than talking. So there's always a room for sort of cooperation in that regards, because cooperation and collaborations to move things forward. And well, one might argue that there's a lack of public engagement when it comes to congestions of Mekong cooperation and with little to no public engagement. But I would say is that if there is no real lines of synergy at the top, it's even harder to engage directly to the public of each riparian Mekong countries. One obvious example would be the elevation of US initiative from Lower Mekong Initiative to Mekong US partnership. It was by design going through the bottom-up approach rather than all the grant and funds from the US to support the Mekong countries do not go directly to the government. It actually goes to civil society, go directly to the peoples and all that, which arguably creating some sort of backlash. But nonetheless, there is a public engagement on the ground, and I still favor a multi-stakeholder approach, whether or not one might argue of participation fatigues or to what extent does from each meeting spelled out, the outcome of each meeting that will be spelled out, and the products from there. But there's no better approach than a pro-engagement, proactive, and being pragmatic as a way forward. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think maybe communications is really important in trying to iron some of these issues. Pai?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks so much for Ajahn Richard for your observation and insights. I am not sure if the rapid blasting projects is jointly cancelled by both China and Thailand, because I'm not seeing any official announcement from China side. But we only see that it's stated pretty clearly in February 2019 Thai Cabinet resolution mentioning the termination of the rapid blasting project or Lan Chang Mekong navigation channel improvement project. It said clearly that this decision is made because of the concern of the people in Thailand, particularly the concern on ecological destruction and impacts on culture of Thai people. So that's how we feel that, or we perceive this as a victory or recognition of people's voice on this decision that made by the Thai cabinet.
And if I could just jump in.
Yes,
well.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think, with public participation, I think, I have been a victim of this participation fatigue in the Mekong region as well. So I actually study the prior consultation process in relation to Mekong mainstream dams. And the problem with these sort of participation processes is they are, they're not seeking consent for these projects. The projects have already been decided. These are a consultation process that are essentially arguments over mitigation issues. They don't provide any sort of accountability mechanisms for local communities who want to seek compensation for damages to their livelihoods, which is why they have to, use creative means like going through the Thai administrative courts to sue the Thai government for their over their extraterritorial obligations. And that's why the Rapids Blasting Project, definitely, I think the civil society and local communities play a huge role in that. And maybe it wasn't mentioned in the most recent decision, but back when the project was first suspended in the early 2000s, it was partly because the Thai Ministry of Defense was very concerned about the Thai-Lao border changing due to the rapids blasting, because the Thai-Lao border along the Mekong River is determined by the deepest part of the channel in the Mekong River. So when you have rapid blasting in these areas, you don't know how that deepest channel is going to change. So I think there might be, still some concern around the potential loss of territory to Laos from the Thai perspective.
Interesting. Thank you very much for all your answers. Let me go to the next set of questions. There is a question by Frederick Klim from RSIS about ASEAN. I'm going to save that question for a little bit because I want to talk about ASEAN in the later part of this conversation. But let me ask just let me go to this rather contentious question, because everyone is asking this question all the time, by Ko Chapop. Is China to blame for the Mekong drying up? That's a $1 million question. Some people say yes, some people say no. So I'll invite everyone to give their views on this. We'll start with Ming Li.
So I've been trying to figure this out as well. And it does involve, wading through quite a few scientific reports. And I think there are information gaps that make it difficult to answer this question. So from the MRC's perspective, they've compared, different, models that have tried to answer this question. And the MRC's conclusion has been that the drought is still the main driver of these water shortages. But I mean, of course, with dams holding back water, this is it could have made the situation a lot worse. So I think, yeah, it is such a contentious issue, and there's been, a whole politicization of these issues around data. So, for example, the key tension within these, the U.S.-China rivalry has taken place over, I think, the models used by, for example, the Mekong Dam Monitor, which has been contested by Chinese universities who argue that these models are not accurate. But at the same time, there isn't a reliable way of estimating how much water the Chinese dams are holding back unless China releases this information itself. So I think, yeah, definitely, there's a need for better cooperation around data management and data sharing in the region to answer these questions and diffuse these sort of tensions.
Right. Hi.
Yeah, thank you, Ajahn Gojapop, for the question. I think it's been asked pretty often. One fact is that even though sometime we heard that only 16% of water in the Mekong is from China, the rest from Laos and other neighboring countries. But one thing is that in northern Thailand, in dry season, more than 95% of water is purely from China. So what happened upstream would have inevitable impacts on the river and communities right here in northern Thailand. When the drought is there and most of the large dam up there keeping up most of the water. And in downstream, there are also two dams, Sayaburi and Don Sahong, particularly Sayaburi. What happened in 19 when the Sayaburi dam started to produce electricity? We have seen the news about the sudden drought, sudden water level decrease, and the clear blue Mekong River, which means the unhealthy stage of the river. So drought is yes, but climate change definitely, but also the dams and the operations exacerbate the existing impacts. And what's not discussed at the top level yet is that how to mitigate these impacts, how to operate the dam for the needs of the downstream river, the downstream communities and downstream ecological needs too, not only for the operation for the electricity. Mm-hmm. That would be my short answer. Thanks.
Thank you. Charadine.
I think this is a gray area to the questions. I don't think there's a black and white to it, but if we talk about it from a technical perspective, and then if we look into the reports and review of MRCs and some others, different organizations report on it, well, we can build dams, but let's say the technical aspect of it should goes with the standardized things that is at the best practice level, not to exceeding that. And I just want to pick on Pai comments on climate change aspect. So perhaps, well, climate change is obvious, it's real. So a combinations of climate change and the increasing build of the dam kind of together go for that droughts and all other natural disasters aspects. But I don't think the dam alone is the one to point finger to. There's other combinations of factors contributing to it. The safety aspects of the dams were claims by China itself. I myself have been to Chiang Hong Dam, which is sort of the biggest dams there, and they have to, so I'm not a technical expert on that, so I can't really attest whether to what extent it complies with the best practices possible. But I think it's a lot of combination of issues, and we shouldn't just blame on any one actors.
Yeah, I think it's really complicated and very difficult to point to, the right answer. It really is probably a combination of different factors in it. But since we're on the topic of China right now, there's another question from Fan Xuan Dong, who is at ICS, Institute of Southeast Asian Studies at NUS. What can induce China, as well as other stakeholders and riparian states of the Mekong, to focus more on tackling the ecological consequences of hydropower dams? What can we get people, all the riparian states actually, to care more about the ecological consequences, to prioritize that and not just about development. I mean, in the long run, right, if we don't deal with these ecological issues, development is going to be affected. So how to have sustainable development, I think. And how do you encourage governments to deal with this issue? Anybody wants to answer the question? Doesn't have to be everybody, just maybe one or two of you who would like to take that question. Hi.
Maybe I can take that quickly.
Okay, let's have Charadine first and then Pai.
Last year, CICPs and Oxfam, we jointly conduct research projects on the aspects of Mekong. What we find out so far is that there's a lack of, again, communications and compromises between those development actors and the grassroots actors on the ground, or particularly affected community on the dam aspects. But also in many parts of the Mekong, those that reside along the Mekong River, they are ethnic group. And what they wouldn't want to relocate. They want to stay there, not for, more for ethical reason, more for historical reason, more like, okay, this is where they belong. They don't want to lose their culture. They don't want to move to a better place even. So it's hard to compromises and sticking to that. For example, the only compromises they would make is that they're not going to move. So what to do? I mean, if for those who work on the grassroots, to work with the grassroots community, they might have a different argument to that. But if somebody working at a policy level might have different contestations to that. But if you are in a research or in a think tanks, then you kind of balance, and it's really hard to make matchmaking between the two, because just of their different diverse opinion in that regards.
Okay, Pai.
Yeah, I think there's ecological civilization is set as one of the priority for China, and I think they actually concerned a lot about the issues surrounding the Mekong River dispute. Just last week, I saw this seminar that organized Sino-Thai dialogue on prosperity between human and water, Lanchang Mekong Water Resource Corporation, that invites quite a number of professors and from Thailand and China. So this kind of things show us that actually China is caring about the Mekong River and how to share this common resource together in a peaceful way and share our goal of ecological civilization is possible if we acknowledge the existing impacts of hydropower and sit down together, bring the voice of the local people and discuss in the friendly manner how to coordinate, how to cooperate the information and solve this problem. I think it's possible, and I'm hopeful. Over 20 years, I started working when there were only 2 dams there, and now 8 already, 11 already. So, but I'm still optimistic, and yeah, and I think we can be good neighbors.
Yeah. Okay. Ming Li, do you want to come in on this as well?
I think it's really important to consider the long-term feasibility of hydropower dams, because in the US and Europe, you're seeing this movement towards actually taking down hydropower dams because they're no longer functioning as they should. And I think these countries have come to the realization that the ecological costs actually outweigh the economic benefits from these dams. So I think that one way to think about this is whether hydropower is actually a feasible energy option for the future, because firstly, you've got climate change, you've got drought. Can these dams perform up to the standard that they actually promised in the first place? You have all these dams across the Mekong River that are built up based on environmental impact assessments that don't really take into account the cumulative impacts of dams that are built all across the river. They're not coordinated. So in that sense, again, are these dams even a feasible solution towards tackling the energy challenges of the region? If we think about food security in the region as well, so the Mekong Delta, for example, being the rice bowl of Vietnam, but with these dams that are depriving the downstream of sediment that form really fertile floodplains that support important agricultural sectors in these countries. Again, is the trade-off worth it? So I think there is a need to think through these issues that actually are relevant to the national interests of all these countries as well.
Yeah, so there are implications and in their interest to take care of these ecological impact of dams. And you can see some of the governments in the region actually turning to other renewable energy resources. So I don't know, how much more the region need to rely on dams for some of these their electricity and development needs. Now, I want to save the last part. We have about 15 minutes left, which is on ASEAN itself. And we have two questions on ASEAN, one from Fred Klim from RSIS and one from Apichai. And they're all related to ASEAN and the kind of roles that ASEAN can play. I mean, if you were to look at the comparison again with the South China Sea, there are implications for ASEAN in the same way that the South China Sea dispute has. It can create divisions. If the Mekong is one of the dangers about bring the Mekong River problem issue into ASEAN is that it might actually add on to some of the divisions. And I think one of the authors, one of the presenters here actually mentioned that. And that, but the divisions between the countries along the Mekong could be a key stumbling block for ASEAN in the future. So actually more needs to be done to sort out these differences, whether through ASEAN or, or some other mechanism. And then it's also important for ASEAN to do more on the Mekong, to incorporate it into the formal ASEAN agenda. You have the infrastructure development and connectivity part of Mekong is also there. So it's not just about resources, but a lot of different issues that are within the Mekong that can be brought to ASEAN. So, it looks like ASEAN at the moment is not very keen to take it up, as someone has noted as well, as it may create all these divisions. But my view is that ASEAN should really try and grasp this issue by its horn, primarily for two reasons. Don't try to dodge it for two reasons. First, dodging might work for now, but it may become an issue and ASEAN will have to take on it eventually. Eventually, these issues are going to come around and it's going to come and bite us, okay? So letting the Mekong issue carry on with the climate and human security implications, and instead of trying to arrest some of these problems right at the beginning, we are going to the issues are going to worsen over time. And then at the time, it might be the ASEAN is forced to face it and it may be too late. And the problems may become even harder to resolve. Now, those are the kind of concerns that I have. So, I mean, I would like your views on that. Is it time for ASEAN to tackle the Mekong issue, put it down as part of its core agenda? Fred Kim asked, what role should ASEAN play in Mekong management, and is that realistic? First of all, should Mekong issue become part of the ASEAN agenda, a core part of the agenda? Secondly, is there a role that ASEAN can realistically play? And then the other question is similar to my first question. So these two questions, if yes, what role can ASEAN play in this issue? Let's start with Ming Li, and then we'll go to Charadine and then Pai.
I think I agree with you, Serena. Like the issues might not be so obvious in terms of how it's relevant to ASEAN right now, but in terms of potentially where it might go, we want to tackle it, but before it's too late. So I think the challenge of having the Mekong on the ASEAN agenda, again, I think relates back to a lot of what I said before, that a lot of these countries benefit from the natural resources of the Mekong River. So even if they are experiencing negative ecological impacts from all sorts of developments upstream, so not necessarily just hydropower dams, they still draw benefits from the Mekong River within their own national boundaries as well. So it's difficult, I guess, to even get all the countries in ASEAN, in the Mekong region to want to have this on the ASEAN agenda, apart from Vietnam. And then, when you go beyond the Mekong region, how is this issue then relevant to other ASEAN nations like Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, who are, really big players in ASEAN as well? How can you make them take notice? I think that's a really important question that I don't necessarily have the answer to as well. But I think, if we think through the non-traditional security issues around food security and human security in the region, I think that's a potentially productive area to work in, in terms of maybe even disaster management if there's like flooding in these areas. That's something that we could build cooperation on to manage tensions that may emerge around these issues. So yeah, I don't have a clear answer to that, but I do think, it is in ASEAN's interest to look hard at these issues, not just around the river, but how it connects to other sectors in ASEAN as well.
Yeah, okay. We'll have Charadine. Yeah, Charadine.
I think in terms of having it as part of the Mekong agenda, it's not something new. In fact, ASEAN has tried before, long ago. We have one homegrown initiative called ASEAN Mekong Basin Development Corporation, if I remember the abbreviation correctly. But I think it was since the 90s. But what is the main angle? Is it for infrastructure connectivity? I think that was the primary aims of connectivity, infrastructure connectivity within the Mekong region and to the rest of maritimes, Southeast Asia, if you were to call it, and make it more seem like connections to ASEAN as a whole. But it slowly died out on its own. There's no more initiative, there's no more meeting, there's no more concrete actions on the ground. There is one railway, in fact, like from Singapore connecting to Laos, if I'm not mistaken, and a few others, but that's about it. There's no concrete. Nobody really want to take more initiative or want to push it forward. Now everyone also talking about ACMEC as another homegrown, which is, and then Thailand taking the lead and so on. But the thing with ACMEC is that it's because it's a homegrown, it sort of require each contributions from member states, and it's hard because the Mekong country is still developing countries, many others, so we don't have millions to contribute for at least for infrastructure connectivity within. I would say we still depends on external sources of support from our development partner in various aspects. And that's what I see as the main constraint of ACMEC. But it's good to at least have the aspirations to push forward the homegrown initiative. But other than that, I see if it's for the immediate future, yes, I definitely think it should be on the agenda. And the way to start perhaps should be in the next EAS or ARF, where all of the external partner of the Mekong that has their own initiative are also part of those EAS and ARF and put it up on the agenda. Not everyone has involvement in the South China Sea. Why is that on the agenda and why Mekong is not? So that's another thing. And I see this is something as a step forward when it comes to try to slot in Mekong on the agenda.
Yeah, I think I agree with Charadine. You're right. The name of the corporation is ASEAN Mekong Basin Development Corporation. Nothing's happening. It needs to be revitalized. It should be relooked at, and ASEAN should think about these issues as a whole. And I mean, it's not just and you're right. Not all ASEAN states are claimants to the South China Sea, but there are interests that Malaysia and Singapore should be concerned about in Mekong. First of all, if there is any instability in the region, it will affect the rest of the region, right? Geopolitical rivalry in the region, there could be spillover effects in any of these countries along that are our neighbors, right? And then there's always the energy, climate change, environmental issues, the issue of climate refugees and all that. These are going to have spillover effects for the rest of ASEAN. So they cannot be, it cannot be that the mainland Southeast Asia, the riparian states of the of the Mekong handle it themselves, because there are going to be effects that's going to affect the rest of Southeast Asia, I imagine, right? Pai?
My quick question is that, yeah, there is definitely a big role for ASEAN to be playing, solving the problem of the Mekong River management issues, but we're still not seeing that action being taken by ASEAN yet. Even the more alarming issues like the conflicts in Myanmar and after the coup, we still don't see concrete action taken yet. So so for the Mekong, I'm not foreseeing any quick response from ASEAN. Yeah.
So I think we all agree that the issue of the Mekong should actually be tabled at ASEAN in some way or other. And Vietnam tried to do it, if I remember correctly, in a few years back, but they failed to get it tabled. There wasn't just enough interest in it. I mean, I think it'd be a shame to wait for the issues to become so serious that it's finally tabled. You know, at the minimal, there could be a working group in ASEAN moving towards looking at these issues. You know, it doesn't have to be at the same high level as South China Sea yet, but there could be a working group that's looking on all these issues. There is one last question on to address the demand side of the ecological consequences, to the ecological consequences of the building of dams on the river. This is by Harrison Cheng from Control Risk. Do we see efforts to tackle this problem from the demand side, the problem of ecological consequences of it? Because with this, I mean, countries are demanding energy, hydropower, and therefore there are these, how can we tackle it from that angle? Are there ways to look at other renewable resources, for example, say solar or wind? You know, our countries, in your countries, Cambodia and Thailand, are they looking at other sources of other than, you know, hydropower? Yeah, maybe Pai can do that. Yeah,
I can go first. Yeah, the fact is that for the past 3 years, Thailand's energy demand has been dropped drastically. In some months, we have more than almost 80% of reserve margin, whilst the country have to pay for the production of electric because of the take or pay kind of power purchase agreement that's signed by Thailand and each of the dams and each of the power producer. And more sadly, during the past year, this year, the hydropower import from Laos are being labeled by Thai government as a non-fossil fuel source. So it's perceived or labeled as a green energy and renewable energy, which is not at all if we consider socio-ecological destruction. And moreover, Singapore is starting to import electricity from hydropower from Laos through transmission line through Thailand and through Malaysia. So I think this is something we need to discuss, that how can we look at the source of energy as hydropower as it is, not mislabel it as green energy. And demand side management there is like wide range of alternatives available, but not being taken seriously or adequately by government in the reference states.
Okay. Anybody else want to chime in on that? Charadine or Ming Li? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, you know, Pai is being very modest, but in terms of, drawing attention to tackling the energy side of the sector, civil society in Thailand has really done a lot to draw attention to tackling the drivers of hydropower development. I think because there's a realization that, you know, trying to speak out against the ecological impacts of the dams was not getting that much traction against among decision makers. So they have actually really turned their attention to looking at the demand side of it. And I think, you know, Thailand civil society has done very good work in terms of pointing out how the political economy around energy demand has actually contributed to this growth of hydropower in the Mekong region. We also see, you know, a lot of international institutions and, you know, Western donors like USAID running lots of events, seminars and projects around discussing what an energy transition in Southeast Asia could look like. So there's definitely a lot of attention being paid to the feasibility of developing solar power as an alternative to meet energy demand in these countries, because the ecological impacts will not be as bad as hydropower development. Solar is also a much cheaper alternative in terms of, putting in the infrastructure compared to building a hydropower dam. So there are these sort of discussions happening at the moment, but I think that, there are still a lot of vested interests amongst, energy ministries, state utilities, the hydropower construction sector, that have a very, big influence on these developments. So, even though there are a lot of concerns around the Lao hydropower dams on the mainstream, just in November last year, after putting off a decision for a while, Thailand actually decided to buy electricity from 3 Lao dams on the mainstream of the river. So unfortunately, it still seems like hydropower is their preferred option in terms of meeting their energy demand, despite the ecological impacts of it and despite it not actually being a clean source of power. Yeah,
I think these developments will have alternative sources will have to take some time to develop. I think that's going to take a bit of time. Charadine, would you like to have a last word before I wrap up?
I think with regards to alternative source of energy, Cambodia itself, we've been trying to at least move towards solar power, but the scale is not enough to really substitute hydropower. And in fact, in the neighboring, provinces along the border, we would rather bought electricity from either Thailand or Laos and Vietnam, which is much cheaper than connecting to the national grid.
Yeah.
So this is some obvious problems that it's really, really hard to making a major shift toward renewable source of energy. Let alone abandon hydropower dam completely.
Yeah, I think it's going to take time for this to happen, and I'm hoping and hopeful that the regional countries will move towards that direction and look for alternative, cleaner sources of water. I think, of power. The final message here, I think, as a form of wrapping up, is that while the panelists and I myself actually do not think that the situation, in the Mekong is as dangerous as the situation in the South China Sea, not to the extent of where we are seeing, a possibility of war breaking out, whether through design or by accident. But we should also be mindful that water is actually really set in a larger geopolitical context. And we do know that sometimes water can be the spark for war, depending on what the geopolitical context is. We should always be keeping that at the back of our mind. But more importantly, in front of us, we're actually confronting a whole host of human and environmental security issues. Those are also security issues. They're not military security issues, but they affect the well-being of people living in the region in many, many ways. And it's not just confined to the riparian countries, but it has implications for the rest of Southeast Asia. And that's why we all think that we should have Mekong on the ASEAN agenda in one form or another. I think that's what the whole panelists here and myself are hoping for. I thank you all for a great presentation and a very, very rich discussion. I hope the audience has benefited from this discussion. So this is the third of CAG's Counterpoint Southeast Asia. We should probably have about 2 or 3 more to the rest of the year. Please look out for our emails on it. I hope you'll join us again in the future. We aim to, get younger scholars, emerging scholars, Southeast Asian scholars to speak about Southeast Asia issues. Thank you very much once again, Ming Li, Pai, Charadine, and everyone who has tuned in. Thank you very much.
ขอบคุณค่ะ สวัสดีค่ะ
Thank you.
Goodbye.
And goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.